Welcome to another Village Torah portion discussion. And yes, you guessed it, our summer rabbinic fellow Emily, Dana, and I are here to do yet again one of our favorite segments, 3 highlights. So once again, if you're not familiar with this style of the Village Torah presentation, 3 highlights, it's Emily starts off, she first presents her 3 highlights from this week's Torah portion, and then I will share with you 3 highlights for me in this week's Torah portion. And this week's Torah portion is the parasha of VaEthanan, or some would say VaEthanan, and it is the second Torah portion in the book of Devarim, or Deuteronomy. So, and I think in many ways we'll find stylistically it retains some resemblances to the first Torah portion in some ways, stylistically, right, Emily?
Yeah, for sure. That was not what I was planning to talk about, because we have some really major things happening in this Torah portion that you just brushed over.
Wonderful. All right, so with that perfect segue, Emily, take it away. 3 highlights.
So my first highlight, because I feel like it has to be, is the 10 Commandments, because we see the 10 Commandments, we saw them back in Exodus, and we see them again in this Torah portion. Most of them are the same. We have a little bit of a difference in how we're told to keep Shabbat. We're told to remember Shabbat, as opposed to the previous time when we're told to keep Shabbat. So many rabbis have argued over what that means. It's also the reason that we say Shamor v'Zachor b'dibur echad. We keep and remember Shabbat. It's also like a little bit less fanfare. From the previous time we got the 10 Commandments in Exodus. The next part that I wanted to focus on is the Shema and VaEhafta, because we say that every time we do services. And this is the Torah portion that comes from. Fun fact, it is also a part of the Torah portion that is in your mezuzah on your door, because the Shema and the VaEhafta are on that piece of paper.
I can absolutely confirm that is indeed a fun fact. I'm very excited about that. Fun. You can walk around. If you're ever wondering what's in the box, fun fact, it's in this week's Torah portion, or at least some of it.
Yeah, some of it is in this week's Torah portion. In case you need a refresher, the VaEhafta tells us that we're supposed to love God with all our heart, soul, being, etc. So
the second paragraph of the Shema is very similar in many ways to the first paragraph, except there's a special insertion, and this is a bit of a spoiler for an upcoming Torah portion, but it inserts a little bit about weather, agricultural rewards, and yes, wine is in there as well. So that'll be a little bit of a difference, and again, that is a spoiler for a forthcoming Torah portion.
The third paragraph of the Shema talks about the commandments to wear tzitzit, which are the tassels at the end of a 4-cornered garment, at the end of a talit or a talis, and the commandment to wrap tefillin, which are the black leather boxes that some people wear on their heads and on their arms every morning when they pray.
Right. Although that stands out, that's the sort of the sore thumb of the Shema, because that actually appears, that third paragraph, in the book of Numbers, and that's a fun one.
And it doesn't actually appear in the prayer book that we use here at Cedar Village, so.
Good to know. That is, I would think we add that to our list of fun facts.
Sure.
That is very, contextual to our experience here.
My last highlight is the name of the parsha itself, VaEthanan. So what does VaEthanan mean? It means roughly, and he pleaded, and he asked, and he begged. And this is referring to Moses asking God to let Moses go into the promised land. Because Moses has already been told he's not allowed to go in, but he's begging him because he wants God to let him go in. And I think that any of us can sort of understand this feeling of yearning to go somewhere you know you're not allowed to go. I think we felt that a lot over the last year. And so I thought that was just sort of potent, and I really like the name of this parsha, because it has nothing to do with the rest of the parsha, but it has to do with this one first part of it that is really important to our story. So those
Awesome.
are my 3 highlights.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Emily. So I'm going to start off with one that Emily did not cover because basically my other 2, and we didn't share notes.
We did not talk.
But basically, 2 of ours basically overlap, are exactly the same thing. But let me start off with the not the same, so you can tell that I was not looking at your notes. So the first one is a description of God. We get like this very clear description of a bunch of characteristics of God. Now we get this in the 4th chapter in verse 31 where it says, "For the Lord your God is a merciful God. He will not fail you, neither destroy you, nor forget the covenant of your fathers, which God swore unto them." Okay, that's lovely. But really fascinatingly, towards the end of the Torah portion in chapter 7, verses 9 through 10, we get something that we actually find in our liturgy, which is a much more expansive description of God's characteristics. "The Lord your God is God, the faithful God who keeps covenants and mercy with those that love him and keep his commandments to 1,000 generations." Now this is what's really interesting. There's sort of the felicitous, sort of the positive, the good connections, and then we get the flip side, which we did not get in the 4th chapter. "And repays those that hate him to their face to destroy them. He will not slack to those that hate him. He will repay him to his face." So that's a really fascinating that we get this sort of direct characterization of God's, I want to say midot, his sort of, his qualities, right. And I'm not a big philosopher person, but it's funny because these things get debated throughout time. Most notably, Maimonides, Rambam, is really not comfortable with these descriptions. He's like, we can't talk about God like that. So Rambam, in Jewish philosophy, or more specifically theology, this has been definitely a debated set of texts that we encounter in this week's Torah portion and describing in Moses' description of God. So I wanted to point that out. We get that very clear thing. But now I want to touch on the 2 that I do overlap, which clearly are, there's some, there's good reason. These are some,
They're
like,
important.
It almost is some of the highlights. It's like a top 10 list. Because one, of course, is the Shema, which we encounter in the 6th chapter, verses 4 through 9. We get this the first paragraph of the Shema. Lovely, okay? It's there. It's part of our liturgy. It's the rabbis, when they were constructing our liturgy, the building blocks of our liturgy, made sure to incorporate and include this paragraph. So it's certainly liturgically important to our tradition, certainly there. And then I want to finish off, as Emily already pointed out, we get a redux. We get a retelling of the 10 Commandments, which we initially encountered in Exodus chapter 20. And there are some, going along with the themes of what we discussed in last week's Torah portion and Parashat Devarim about, Moses likes to tell things a little bit similarly and also make some adjustments of his own. So as Emily pointed out, we get some changes, especially around Shabbat. Now, one change Emily already pointed out in this week's Torah portion, it mentions guarding Shabbat. Shemor et Shabbat lekadsho instead of zachor, of remembering. There's a guarding aspect, which the rabbis later understood is sort of like what we encounter in this week's Torah portion, more to guard against proscriptive activities, things that we should avoid. And then characterizing that which we encounter in Exodus 20, Zachor, as more of the prescriptive activities, things that we should go out to do. For instance, Kiddush. Kiddush is sort of the whole mitzvah of doing Kiddush comes through the rabbis from Exodus 20. And then here, what we get Shemor et HaShabbat Lekadsho, of guarding Shabbat, to sanctify it, is really more of not lighting fires, not cooking, on all those sorts of activities. But something that for me, I find particularly fascinating is I like to always think about why do we do what we do? And so we have in both Exodus 20 and in this week's Torah portion, different reasons as to why we should observe Shabbat. So in Exodus 20, the reason given why we should mention, or at least zachor, to remember that, to remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy, is because God created the earth in 6 days and relaxed on the seventh. Wonderful. We should remember it for that reason. But here in Moses' retelling, it's actually a different reason. The different reason for why we should guard Shabbat is because God took us out from the land of Egypt with an outstretched arm, and that is why we remember. That is why we guard. Okay, it's really fascinating, from God's, if we wanted to think about it sort of perspective-wise, from God's perspective in Exodus 20, it's because of what he did, that we should emulate God. God, when he created everything, God, at least in the telling in the book of Genesis, so we should emulate God by being productive 6 days a week and relaxing on the seventh. Here it's a very different model as to why Shabbat is so important. It's almost more about the relationship, as Moses is describing. It's the relationship that we wouldn't exist as a nation were it not for God taking us out of Egypt, and that's a special relationship that we have with God. So, and actually that expression seems to come a lot in, it happens in the Torah, that it's a lot about the relationship between the Jewish people and God. And so I just find that fascinating, that the reasoning behind Shabbat is different here than expressed in Exodus 20. All right, well, Emily and I hope you enjoyed that. And that's another, I guess that wraps it up for another 3 highlight segment of Village Torah. I do want to mention before we go that all Jewish life and programming here at Cedar Village is fiscally sponsored by the Jewish Home of Cincinnati, and we thank the Jewish Home of Cincinnati very much for their sponsorship of our efforts here in Jewish life and programming. So awesome. All right. Well, thank you, Emily. This is great. And thank you for watching. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.